There are people in this world who are very good at making you feel small without ever raising their voice. They do it with a glance, with a pause just long enough to be noticed, with a seating arrangement. I want to tell you about a young woman named Miss Lennox, Eleanor Lennox, who understood this particular cruelty better than most, and about the Earl of Marlowe, who one evening in late October did something so quiet and so deliberate that every person in the room understood exactly what it meant. Every single one. But first, pull your chair a little closer, friends. This is the kind of story that deserves your full attention. Eleanor Lennox had come to Aldenmere Park not as a guest. That distinction mattered enormously to the people who lived there, and somewhat less to Eleanor herself, who had long since learned to carry her dignity with her rather than look for it in the opinions of others. She had come as a translator. Lord Sutcliffe, the aging patriarch of the family whose name was on the estate, had recently acquired a collection of correspondence in French and Italian from a minor Florentine nobleman, correspondence which he believed contained references to a painting he was trying to trace. Eleanor had been recommended by her late father's colleague at the university in Edinburgh, and she had arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in a modest travelling dress, with 2 trunks and a leather case of reference books. She spoke 4 languages with precision and read 2 more with patience. She had spent 3 years in Paris and another 2 in Rome. She had translated legal documents, personal letters, and one quite remarkable set of architectural drawings for a man who had since become a Minister of Parliament. None of this, as far as the Sutcliffe family was concerned, made her a person of any particular consequence. She was, to put it plainly, a woman who had come to work. The family she found at Aldenmere was large enough to be uncomfortable, to be uncarved. Lord Sutcliffe himself was kind in an absent-minded sort of way. He called her my dear, and forgot her name twice before dinner on the first evening, which she found more endearing than offensive. His wife, Lady Sutcliffe, was a woman made entirely of straight lines. Her posture was a statement. Her courtesy was a performance. She had welcomed Eleanor with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and shown her to a room in the east wing, the wing where the linen was stored, and where the light came in at an angle that made reading after 3 o'clock in the afternoon nearly impossible. Eleanor had opened her reference books and said nothing. There were 2 daughters, Miss Sutcliffe, the elder, and Miss Arabella Sutcliffe, the younger. Miss Sutcliffe was engaged to a baronet from Shropshire, and spent most of her time discussing the wedding with anyone who would listen. Arabella was 20 and pretty, and had already decided upon meeting Eleanor that she had nothing useful to learn from a woman who'd so dressed worth mentioning and then had no connections often worthning. And then there was the Earl of Marlowe. He had arrived 2 days after Eleanor, which meant she had already found her footing by the time he appeared, or found the particular kind of footing one finds when one has accepted that the ground is uneven. Lord Marlowe was a friend of the family by way of a long business arrangement with Lord Sutcliffe, which made him a guest of some standing, though he seemed not to particularly enjoy standing anywhere near the rest of the guests. He was 36, dark-haired, and had the expression of a man who had attended enough social gatherings to know exactly how they would proceed, and had made his peace, however reluctant, with attending them anyway. He noticed Miss Lennox on his second evening at Aldenmere. She was in the library, not the formal library with the mahogany shelves and the busts of Greek philosophers, but the smaller working room off the east corridor, where Lord Sutcliffe had deposited the Florentine correspondence in 3 cardboard boxes, was at the desk with a lamp pulled close and his dictionary open beside her, and she was frowning at a letter written in a hand so cramped it looked like the writer had been conserving paper on principle. "Is it legible?" Lord Marlowe asked from the doorway. She looked up without startlement, which he noticed. "Barely," she said. The writer had an unusual habit of running his final words into the margin, rather than beginning a new line. "I've seen it before in certain Venetian documents, but not quite like this." He came into the room because the answer interested him, and because a woman who referenced Venetian documents in passing without any apparent interest in impressing him was unusual enough to warrant further investigation. "What does it say?" "So far," she said, "it says that the writer's brother has been very tiresome about money, that the summer was hotter than it had any right to be, and that the painting in question is almost certainly not where Lord Sutcliffe believes it to be." She paused. "He is not going to be pleased about that last part." "No," Lord Marlowe said, "he is not." She turned back to her work. She did not seem to feel any obligation to sustain the conversation, which Lord Marlowe found not refreshing exactly, but honest. Most people in his acquaintance sustained conversations, the way they maintained hedgerows, out of a sense of propriety rather than any genuine interest in what was growing there. He stood a moment longer, then left. "Now, I want you to pay attention to what happened next, because this is where the story turns. Not dramatically, not with a scene or a revelation, but with something much smaller and much more revealing. It turned at a dinner table. Lord Sutcliffe, you should know, was a man who observed seating arrangements with the same seriousness other men reserved for property law. There was an order to his table, and it reflected, with some precision, his understanding of the relative importance of every person in the room. At the head were the Sutcliffes, at the far end, the baronet from Shropshire, elevated by virtue of his engagement to Miss Sutcliffe. Lord Marlowe was placed to Lady Sutcliffe's right, as befitted his rank. Arabella was placed across from a young man whose family owned considerable property in Yorkshire, and who had recently and suspiciously remembered his friendship with the Sutcliffes. Miss Lennox was placed at the corner of the table. Not quite at the end, that would have been too obvious, but at the corner, on the far side, near the wall and near the door used by the footman, in a position that required her to turn sideways slightly if she wanted to speak to anyone, and which meant that the light from the chandelier fell mostly behind her rather than on her. It was, in its way, a masterwork of social engineering. She was present, and she was nowhere. She took the seat, without expression. Eleanor Lennox had learned some years ago that the way a person receives an insult tells those around them nearly as much as the insult itself. She received it the way she had received others, with her spine straight and her attention directed toward the soup, which was a bisque and quite good. Lord Marlowe was watching. He had observed the arrangement when he came in. He had the kind of eye that took in a room completely. In the first few seconds, a habit formed from years of navigating gatherings where the position of every person was also the position of every interest. And he had seen where Eleanor had been placed, and he had seen her take the seat, and he had seen Lady Sutcliffe's small, satisfied pause before she addressed the table. He sat. He unfolded his napkin. He said nothing yet. The meal began. Conversation moved the way it always moved at Lord Sutcliffe's table. In organized circuits, Lord Sutcliffe holding court on the subject of Roman antiquities, Lady Sutcliffe managing the social temperature with the efficiency of a woman who considers emotion a weather system to be monitored and controlled. The baronet was agreeable. Arabella was charming. The young man from Yorkshire was audible. Miss Lennox ate her soup and said nothing, because no one had addressed anything to her. And then Lord Sutcliffe, midway through the fish course, raised a small question about the provenance of a particular Renaissance artist whose name had come up in the correspondence, and directed it, out of habit, presumably, toward the table at large. "The workshop of Ghirlandaio," Etna said, from her corner, without looking up from her plate. "If the letter is the one I read this afternoon." The painting was recorded in the workshop inventory in 1489, not as a finished work but as a study. The provenance is murky after that, because the workshop changed hands twice and before the turn of the century. There was a pause. It was not the silence of people absorbing new information, it was the silence of people recalibrating, deciding how to feel about the fact that the woman at the corner of the table had just answered the question more precisely than anyone else in the room could have done, and had done it in the same quiet tone she might have used to pass the salt. Arabella looked at her mother. Lady Sutcliffe's expression did not change. but her chin moved up by approximately 1/4 of an inch. "Quite," said Lord Sutcliffe, who was delighted and had no idea what he was supposed to be feeling instead. And that is when Lord Marlowe pushed back his chair, not dramatically, not with any announcement. He simply stood, picked up his plate and his glass, walked the length of the table, and sat down in the empty chair beside Miss Lennox. A chair that had been empty, it's worth noting, because the table had been arranged so that she sat beside nobody. He set his glass down. He looked at Eleanor. "Tell me about the workshop," he said. The room was very quiet for a moment. Friends, I have thought about that moment many times. Not because it was romantic, though it was. Not because it was defiant, though it was that too. I have thought about it because it was honest. Lord Marlowe understood. As some people do, and others spend their whole the position you accept at a table tells the room what you believe about yourself and about the person sitting at the corner. He had decided, without ceremony, without explanation, what he believed. Miss Lennox looked at him. Something crossed her face, not surprise exactly, because Eleanor Lennox was not easily surprised. Something more like recognition, as though she had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, to find out what kind of man he was. The workshop of Ghirlandaio trained a considerable number of painters, she said, in the same level voice. The most famous of them was a young man from Florence, who went on to be somewhat notable. She paused. Michelangelo. Lord Marlowe's mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood. Somewhat notable, he repeated. I try not to overstate. The conversation continued. Around them, the rest of the table resumed its own proceedings, though with the slightly altered quality. People who have witnessed something, they are still deciding how to classify. Lady Sutcliffe redirected her attention to the baronet, with the focus of a woman who has been presented with a problem she intends to manage rather than acknowledge. Arabella whispered something to the young man from Yorkshire. Lord Sutcliffe, happily unaware of any tension whatsoever, began a new monologue about the city of Florence. But before we go further, I want to stop for just a moment, friends, because this is the kind of story that Moonlight at Marlowe was built for. Stories where the truth comes out sideways. Where the bravest thing in the room isn't a speech. It's a man picking up his plate and walking across a dining room. If you haven't already, consider subscribing. There are more evenings like this one waiting for you here, and I do not want you to miss a single one. Now, where were we? Ah yes, the days that followed. What happened between Lord Marlowe and Miss Lennox after that dinner was not, in the conventional sense, a courtship. It was more like a series of conversations that kept happening because both of them kept finding reasons to be in the same room. He came back to the East Corridor workroom on the following afternoon. She was again at the desk. He brought a chair without asking, and placed it across from her and picked up one of her reference volumes and began reading it, which she found simultaneously presumptuous and agreeable. You read Italian, she said without looking up. Tolerably, he said. That word in the third line of... The one that looks like calcolar, but isn't. He looked. Calcolato, he said. Calculated. As in deliberate. That's what I thought, she said. It changes the sentence considerably. In what way? The writer isn't describing a sale. He's describing a plan. She sat back. Someone arranged for the painting to leave Florence. It wasn't a transaction. It was a removal. Lord Marlowe set down the reference volume. Does Lord Sutcliffe know? Not yet. She looked at him with a directness that he was still getting used to. I find it best to be certain before delivering unwelcome news, a prudent philosophy. And a rare one, she said, with a slight emphasis that he chose to take personally and did not protest. They worked in silence for a while, which was, and I want to be precise about this, because it matters, companionable rather than uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who did not feel the need to fill space with noise to prove they were at ease with each other. They were, in fact, at ease with each other. This was not something either of them would have predicted or, if pressed, would have been able to fully explain. There was another dinner, and another. Lord Marlowe did not move his chair again. He had made his statement and had no interest in making it repeatedly, which would have diminished its meaning. Instead, Lady Sutcliffe, with the adjustments of a woman managing an unexpected variable, had shifted the seating so that Miss Lennox was placed slightly less, invisibly. Not beside Lord Marlowe, but visible. It was, in its way, a concession, and Lady Sutcliffe made it without appearing to notice she had made it, which was the only way she could have made it at all. On the fifth evening there was a small gathering in the drawing-room after dinner. Someone suggested cards. Lord Marlowe declined, which surprised no one. Arabella played the pianoforte, which she did with competence and considerably more enthusiasm than accuracy. Miss Lennox sat to one side with a glass of wine, and an older gentleman, a Mr. Cadwell, a retired soldier, who was a distant connection of the Sutcliffes, and who spent most gatherings in a chair by the fire, began talking to her about the Italian campaign of 1799. Mr. Cadwell was 81 years old. He had fought at the Battle of the Nile, and he had stories that would have made a novelist weep. But he was 81 and old and spoke with a slight tremor, and most of the young people in the room had found, over the course of the week, that they had other things to attend to whenever he settled in to speak. Eleanor did not. She turned toward him fully. She asked questions, good questions, the kind that opened rather than closed. When he mentioned the commander of a particular French division, she noted that she had come across correspondence referencing the same name in an unrelated context, which delighted him. When he lost his thread and had to retrace it, she waited with complete patience. When he laughed at something, she laughed performance, because it was genuinely funny. Marlowe. Lord Marlowe, from across the room, watched this, and what he felt. I will tell you what he felt, because I think it matters more than what he said, which was, for a while, nothing, was something like relief. The particular relief of a man who has been presented with evidence that confirms something he had already begun to suspect. She was exactly who she appeared to be. There was no performance in that room with Mr. Cadwell. There was only a young woman who found an old soldier genuinely worth her time, and gave it to him without counting the cost. He crossed the room. He sat in the chair on the other side of Mr. Cadwell. "Tell me about the Nile," he said. Mr. Cadwell looked at him with some surprise. Lord Marlowe was not, as a rule, a man who sought out company, and then with considerable pleasure, and the three of them sat there, while Arabella played somewhat enthusiastically in the background, and Lady Sutcliffe managed the temperature of the room, and talked about a battle that had been fought before Eleanor or Lord Marlowe had been born. And it was, by every measure, one of the better conversations any of them had that week. Now, I am going to ask you to hold on for just a moment, because what comes next is the part that changes everything, and it requires a little setup to make sense. You should know that on the morning of the 6th day, Eleanor had finished the bulk of the translation. She had drafted a full report for Lord Sutcliffe, which contained, among other things, the confirmation that the painting he was looking for was almost certainly in the possession of a family in Naples who had acquired it, through the deliberate removal she had identified. Sometime around 1502, the report was careful, thorough, and delivered with one additional note. She had found in the very last letter in the third box a reference to a second painting, smaller, that the Florentine nobleman had described as infinitely more interesting than the first, and which had been sent, not to Naples, but to a monastery in Siena. She brought the report to Lord Sutcliffe in his study, and set it on his desk. He read the first page. He looked up. "A monastery in Siena," he said. "Yes, my lord, and you believe the record is credible." "The handwriting on that letter is the clearest of anything in the collection," she said. The writer stopped conserving paper. I believe he considered it important enough to write carefully. Lord Sutcliffe looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment. "My dear," he said, and he meant it this time, she thought, "you have done extraordinary work." She thanked him with exactly as much warmth as was warranted and went to collect her things from the East Wing workroom. Lord Marlowe was waiting in the corridor outside. She stopped when she saw him. "You knew I was finished today," she said. "It was not a question. Lord Sutcliffe told me at breakfast that you'd been working through the last box last night." He was leaning against the wall with the careful casualness of a man who had decided to be there and did not intend to justify it. "I thought I would." He stopped. This was unusual. Eleanor had not yet seen Lord Marlowe stop in the middle of a sentence for want of the right word. She waited. "I thought I would make sure," he said finally, "that you had been paid correctly. These arrangements are often informal, when the work is done by someone who is not formally engaged." Eleanor looked at him. "That is a very practical thing to be concerned about," she said. "I am a practical man." "You are not entirely a practical man," she said. "A practical man does not move his plate across a dining room." He held her gaze. Something shifted in his expression, not opening exactly, but unlocking. "No," he said, "I suppose he doesn't." There was a pause that lasted long enough to be something. "Miss Lennox," he said, "I wonder if I might." He stopped again. She would tell you if you asked her that this was the moment she decided to be patient with him. He was a man who had spent a long time arranging his words before he spoke them, and here he was, twice now, arranging them and finding them wanting. She thought it was, in its way, the most honest thing he had done. "Lord Marlowe," she said carefully, "I expect I will be in Edinburgh in 3 weeks' time. I have a forwarding address at the university, care of Professor Stanhope." She watched him, absorbed that. "Professor Stanhope," he repeated. "He was my father's colleague. He can be trusted to see that letters reach me." She adjusted the strap of her leather case, provided they are written, of course. She left him standing in the corridor. "Now, friends, I want to say something here before we continue. I have told you this story because I believe there is something in it worth keeping. Not the romance, though the romance is the easier thing to remember. Not even the moment at the dinner table, though Lord Marlowe picking up his plate and walking across that room is, I will admit, the kind of thing I return to on evenings when the world has felt particularly inclined toward pretension. What I want you to keep is the thing between that moment and the corridor outside the East Wing. It is the days between. The silences that didn't need filling, the questions that opened rather than closed. Mr. Cadwell by the fire. The moment of watching someone be exactly who they appear to be and feeling that particular relief. That is the real story, friends. The rest is just what followed. What followed, since I can see you are not satisfied with that, was this: a letter arrived in Edinburgh 7 days after Eleanor returned home. It was addressed to Miss E. Lennox, care of Professor Stanhope, in a hand she did not recognize but did not need to, because there was only one person who had that address. The letter was 2 pages long. It began with a practical question about the second painting, whether she thought it was still in Siena, and whether she would be willing to consult on a second stage of the research, and ended with something that was not a practical question at all, but was phrased as one. Because Lord Marlowe was, despite everything, still Lord Marlowe. He asked whether she expected to be in London before the end of the season, and whether, if she were, she might find it convenient to take tea with a man who had recently discovered that his Italian was less tolerably useful than he had believed, and who thought he might benefit from instruction. Eleanor read the letter twice. She put it on her desk beside a reference volume on Florentine guilds. She looked at it for approximately 45 seconds. Then she wrote back. She said that she did believe the painting was still in Siena, and that she would be glad to consult further. She said that she would be in London in the 2nd week of November. She said that tea would be perfectly convenient, and then she added, at the bottom of the page, in her clearest and most careful handwriting, because she was a woman who had spent years translating other people's words and knew the difference between what was written and what was meant, a single line. His Italian, she suspected, was better than he said. She sealed the letter. She sent it. And that, friends, that is how it began. If you've stayed with me to the end of this evening, and I do hope you have, then you already know why I keep telling the stories. Because the world is full of people who arrange the seating. full of Lady Sutcliffes and their quarter-inch chin raises, and their East Wing rooms and their particular talent for making presents into invisibility. And every now and then, in the middle of it all, someone stands up and moves their chair. I think that is worth a story. I think that is worth your subscription too, if you haven't already. Come back to Moonlight at Marlowe, friends. The fire is still lit, and I have more evenings waiting for you, just like this one, where someone stands up and does the quiet, unannounced, entirely unmistakable right thing. I'll see you at the next story, and if the person beside you deserves better than the corner of the table, I trust you know what to do.